As we move along on our road trip to the villages of Hastings County, we arrive at the very active village of Tweed. Actually, since 1969, it has been the municipality of Tweed bringing together all of the Hungerford Township and the township of Elsevier and Grimsthorpe, along with the village of Tweed. Currently, we have about 6,500 people in this community. However, going back to the 1800s, as the lower townships of Hastings County filled in with agriculture and with businesses, the more enterprising settlers came a little bit north to find new areas to set up their farms and set up their businesses. The first requirement, of course, was to settle on a river, where you could have a mill to grind the grain, a sawmill to create the lumber to build the communities, and possibly a woolen mill to weave the fabric for homemade clothing. In thinking about the early settlers, we have to bear in mind they arrived here with what they could carry on their back, possibly with a horse to carry some goods, and for the lucky ones, maybe a wagon. But they had nothing more than this when they first arrived in this area. We're very fortunate today to have with us the local historian and the curator of the Tweed and Area Heritage Museum, Mr. Evan Morton. Evan, would you tell us about the early days of the settlement of Tweed and how the people came here and how they established this very interesting community?
The first white settlers to settle in this area were on Sugar Island in 1826. And in 1828, Richard Woodcock built a shanty at the mouth of the river. So he was actually the first resident of Tweed. And then the community grew. In fact, there were two communities. To the north of River Street was a community called, firstly, Munroe's Mills, then Hungerford Mills, and then finally Tweed. This area where we are here by the lake was a different community. It was called Georgetown. And it was owned by Felix Gabory, who had a town site laid out by surveyor John Emerson in 1849. James Jamieson bought the mills in 1850, and he had Emerson do a town site to the north of here, and it was named Tweed after the Scottish River Tweed.
Thank you, Evan. Now, as we come through the later 1800s, we notice in this area, many of the villages are in decline. The lumber industry was becoming exhausted, the mines were closing, and even some of the small marginal farms that could support a family earlier on were no longer viable and people were moving away. However, for some reason, Tweed held its own. Through these difficult years, it remained steady, it grew, possibly at a slower rate, but it did become the center of business activity and agriculture activity for Hungerford Township. Evan, could you tell us what factors worked in Tweed's favor to make it the center of activity in this area?
The area grew basically because of water. We have both the river and the lake. Whereas the community had grown basically as a service center for the increasing numbers of settlers and drew different tradespeople like blacksmiths, carriage makers, harness makers, and so on, as well as different merchants. It was really the railroads that gave Tweed the boost. The Ontario and Quebec Railway, which was then leased by the Canadian Pacific Railway, opened in Tweed in 1884. And you immediately saw after that the construction of the brick commercial blocks in the downtown area. The first was William White's Hardware, which was built in 1884. And that continued and even grew more with the arrival of the second railway, which was the Napanee, Tamworth and Quebec Railway, which came in 1889. The following year, since there had been a connection between Yarker and Harrowsmith on the Kingston and Pembroke Railway, and thus access to Kingston, the railway was changed to the Kingston Napanee and Western Railway. A few years later, it became the Bay of Quinte Railway, and then after it was in financial distress in the early teens, it was taken over by the Canadian Northern, and that in turn was taken over by Canadian National. The basic main street that you see here in Tweed was built in that 20-year period from 1884 to 1905. After that, the main drive for Tweed was the Department of Lands and Forests, or Ministry of Natural Resources as it became. That was a major force in the community until it was pulled out in the mid-1990s.
As we come up to today, Tweed actually has some very interesting features. It has the smallest jailhouse in Canada, which is now used, of course, as a tourist information area. It has a very interesting summer dance pavilion right on the lake overlooking beautiful Stokoe Lake. And back in the 1940s and the early years, summer dance pavilions were in many communities and were very popular for the weekend for the young crowd to come out, and I'm sure being by the lake were very romantic areas. Also, Elvis comes to Tweed every year and is part of a very big festival in the summertime. And one very important aspect of Tweed that you should see while you're here is the Tweed and District Heritage Centre, with amazing displays of artifacts and the archives that are protecting the photographic and documentary history of this area. So while you're out on your road trip in Hastings County, stop in Tweed, take a look at the plaques, take a walk down the main street, enjoy the very interesting shops, and enjoy your time in the village of Tweed.